Welcome to Good God, conversations that matter about faith and public life. I'm your host, George Mason, and this is Good God, where we are focusing on the question of poverty during this series. And today, my guest is Jason Coker, Dr. Jason Coker, Reverend Dr. Jason Coker, who has both been a pastor and an organizational leader. And he is now the national director of a program called Together We Hope, which is a rural development coalition that addresses poverty especially in rural areas. And so, Jason, welcome to the program. Thank you for being on here.
Thanks so much, George. It's a pleasure to be with you. I know you have a lot of folks that listen in to you. So it really is an honor to be here and to kind of raise the voice of rural poverty in America. Together for Hope is, we fight that every day, all day long. So thank you.
Well, now, just as full disclosure, Jason and I go back a ways, and we have worked together for 1 year. He was on the staff of the church I pastor here in Dallas, Wilshire Baptist, as our missions minister. And he went to become a pastor in Connecticut for a season of his life, where he also worked on his PhD at Yale University, or Yale Divinity School, which?
Well, I did my master's at Yale Div School and then did a PhD at Drew University.
Thank you. I got those reversed, so there you go. Okay, great. And interestingly enough, your work in the New Testament, book of James, was on poverty, wasn't it? And how the faith community addresses that.
Yeah, the first book I wrote was James in Postcolonial Perspective, the letter as native as discourse. And it really talked about how James and the whole letter faced down the Roman Empire in some pretty profound ways, specifically around economics and land ownership. If you look at James chapter 5, 1-6, that certainly deals with land ownership. James chapter 2, 1-13 deals with people in fine clothing and gold rings coming into your sanctuary, and how there was this indictment against showing partiality to the wealthy and then over against the poor. And so there's a lifting up of the poor in James for sure.
Now, Jason, to hear you read the Bible like that would open you to the criticism from the right that you're really a Marxist after all, aren't you? You're doing a kind of socioeconomic reading of the Bible. And I actually had someone who's a newspaper a columnist here in Dallas say that preachers today are going to be called before the throne of judgment because they're reading the Bible in just that way.
Well, I invite those critics to actually read the Bible and actually read the Communist Manifesto. It's worth a read. It's actually a pretty short document. I'll never forget the first time I read the manifesto and had to reread it again because I was waiting to read the part with the devil with horns. And it's actually there's some good things there that's important to kind of consider.
Well, it's sort of a utopian vision, isn't it? Really, and human nature gets in the way of these things. But
look, a good utopia is hard to find. Let's face
it. That's right, exactly. All right, but let's get down in the weeds a little bit about this matter of poverty, because we are currently involved in an enormous expansion of wealth in this country. In our own country, and yet an enormous contraction of wealth at the very same time. So we're moving in two different directions, aren't we? Yeah. And so what's your take on the state of our adequacy in terms of what people have and what they need in America today?
So two things come to my mind immediately. One is the economic inequality in the United States of America right now is greater than it ever has been in the history of this country. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That is very hard to kind of comprehend. But during the robber baron periods, the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, mm-hmm. The Rockefellers, economic inequality was less than what it is today.
Wow.
And so we live in unprecedented moment of economic inequality, and that economic inequality is weighted towards the wealthiest people in this country.
Yeah.
So the threshold for a family of four to be in the top 10% of income earners, a family of four would need to make $114,000 a year. So that means 90% of the United States of America lives on less than $114,000 a year for a family of four. Now, if you're making $114,000 a year and you have a family of four and you're living anywhere close to a city, you know that you're not saving a lot of money. You probably have credit card debt. You certainly have student loan debt, and you're living paycheck to paycheck. All that to say that 90% of this country lives on less than that.
Yes.
That's the kind of country we live in right now. It's very hard economically to survive in the United States of America, much less thrive. So economic inequality comes to mind. The other one is the movement away from the narrative of poverty from an individualist perspective to a systemic perspective. And when you look at poverty from a systemic perspective, you automatically have to pay attention to policy. Poverty in America is not an individual problem. Poverty in America is a policy problem. Since 1980, we've been walking away from the New Deal and dismantling tax structures that supported the social safety net for 40 years, most of my life. And right now, we do not care for the poor in this country. We actually blame them for being poor. So policies like NAFTA may have been good for business, but they were terrible for American laborers. When China entered into the world, oh my goodness, what's the
World Trade Organization?
World Trade Organization, WTO. That was a huge issue in rural America. So our farmers, and not just the farmers, the landowners, but the laborers who worked for them, all of a sudden had to compete against China and things of that nature on a global level. So even in rural space, there was a loss of jobs, and those jobs became devalued from a labor perspective through national policy. So policy creates the massive poverty that we have. And we do not live in a country that full of lazy people. We are still one of the most hardworking countries in the world, and our people just don't have the jobs because those jobs aren't in America anymore. So that's a real thing.
Now let's stop there for a moment and consider the irony that the very people you're talking about who are in more rural settings and who are hardworking people and who have been most deeply affected negatively by globalization and by policy are yet people who have conservative values and politically are voting against their own interest. Do you have a sense of why that is?
I think there is, to a certain degree. There are rural spaces are more conservative in general. But and Together for Hope, we look at those 301 counties of persistent rural poverty in America. So persistent rural poverty means it's a rural county. It has 20% or more of that population living below the federal poverty line for the last 30 years.
Wow.
And there's 301 of those counties. Now, those counties, if you look at a map, cluster into what we call 5 ethnogeographies of persistent rural poverty. You have Appalachia, you have the Mississippi River Delta, you have the Black Belt, which goes from Alabama to Southern Virginia, you have the Rio Grande Valley, which is the Texas-Mexico border, and then you have native lands, which are mostly Native Americans. So persistent rural poverty in America is white, it's black, it's brown, and it's native. And those regions suffer from economic deprivation, not because people are lazy, but if you look at those areas, you talk about the movement away from coal. That's a collapse of an entire industry. You have the mechanization of labor in the Delta Black Belt and Rio Grande Valley. That is a devaluation of human labor, a movement away from human labor. And so most of the regions or policy, with NAFTA and the manufacturing jobs moving offshore and out of country. In every one of those regions, you've had industry that has abandoned labor. And that is exactly the cause of the kind of unemployment that exists there. And it's called rural overpopulation. Doesn't mean there's too many people that live there. It just means that the people who do live there there aren't enough jobs for them. So they're literally abandoned by industry and are stuck.
So what's the answer to that? Because, we pride ourselves on having a free market and an approach that basically says if a company can't make money here, they can take their business elsewhere if they need cheaper labor or whatever. And then there's a kind of breaking of the sort of covenant of community that existed at one time between, say, that factory or that farm and that particular community in a rural place, or that mine, say. Now, in a more managed economy, which in its more extreme form would be, say, China, there is a deliberate attempt to manipulate how the marketplace operates and take care of what happens when you're going to shift priorities in the market. But in our culture, government is not supposed to do that directly. That's sort of left to the private sector to do. And anytime government starts to get into that, we are concerned about, again, a more socialist incursion into our model. How do we live between those two models in a way that's constructive and that addresses this persistent problem of poverty?
Well, I think history is a great example of that. If you look at the economy of the United States after the Great Depression and the movement, the work of the New Deal with FDR, mm-hmm. you had the breaking up of monopolies, the move to the heavy taxation on the wealthiest people in this country, mm-hmm. and it basically took money from the top and invested it in the people of this country. And it immediately rose the bottom. The people who were at the very bottom began to move into a middle class. And that was that period between the beginning of the New Deal and 1978 and 1980 was some of the greatest economic production this country's ever had. Right. And I really do think it's the nostalgia of that period that is the power behind Make America Great Again. There really was less economic inequality there, in spite of the fact that it was much more systemic. Well, I don't say more systemic racism, but the racism was more blatant. It was during Jim Crow era. And yet the economy functioned better, even within minority communities. You look at post-Jim Crow and the dismantling of Black businesses and Black HBCUs, Black institutions in general have suffered since the dismantling of Jim Crow, right, because of racism. But all that to be said, during the time of our greatest social safety net, this country had the greatest amount of economic production it's ever had. Right. And when we started dismantling that and rolling back New Deal tax cuts to the wealthiest, we began to literally pull America to the extremes, from the high poverty, high wealth. And now we live in that space of economic inequality. And we're being challenged now by a China and a Russia that is hyper-capitalist, and is forcing, and we feel that pressure to even be more deregulated and free market driven, but we don't factor into real costs to things. And that ecologically, it's destroying the world. So we do need more regulations to make sure we don't have unfettered capitalism. Even a Harvard business professor, there's a new book out, it's sitting right over there, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. And she talks about how to calculate real costs and things of that nature. So when you have free market tends to manipulate prices too, to the benefit of those who are wealthy. So it's certainly complex, but like I said, poverty is an issue of policy, and it'll take policy to change it. George, we have only passed one federal policy since 1980 whose purpose was to help the most vulnerable in this society, and it was the Affordable Care Act. And look at what we've done. Obama, and look at what we've tried to do to that since it's become the law of the land.
Okay, so Jason, for those who are listening to what you're saying, and who would say, that's fine if you want to work on that as in a nonprofit and all of that, but you're getting out of your lane here if you're talking about what religious communities ought to be doing. The church, the synagogue, the mosque, religious communities should pay attention to the spiritual lives of people and not get into economic policy and politics and policy and all these sorts of things, because now we can't be experts in that. We have to leave that to economists. We have to leave that to business people, because that's their sphere of expertise. Yeah. What do you say to those who would make critique of religious communities? And people like you and me, we get this all the time. But I think articulating why we're talking about this and why we think we might have something to offer is worth part of the conversation here.
I would argue up and down that, yes, this is political. And if people of ethics, people with morals, don't speak into the political, what should we expect from the political?
Yeah.
I mean, it demands that. And it is a moral issue. I mean, there is a little book in the New Testament called James, and in that book, and I'll go back to it because I've spent like almost 20 years of my life on those 5 chapters. There's a section that says, "What good is your faith if you say to somebody who's hungry and naked, be clothed and well fed, go in peace?"
Yes.
That is faith without works. And according to that little book of the Bible, that is dead. And it's not just dead because it's a dead faith. It's dead because it leads that person who is hungry and naked to their death.
Well, and let's go back to the Hebrew scriptures as well, because so Israel was born as a people out of slavery in Egypt. I mean, they were brought out of an economic situation where they were being oppressed economically. They were not personally profiting. They were profiting only their owners, so to speak. And then when they leave Egypt, they are given bread and manna in the wilderness and quail to eat and water from a rock as a sort of sign of God's provision for them. But they are also instructed that they are supposed to take care of one another, that they are not supposed to abuse laborers, that they're supposed to pay for their work, and they are to create a model of a civilization, of a people that would teach others not to be like Egypt. Don't abuse your workers, but treat them fairly. And all through the book of Proverbs, the wisdom literature, and even in the Psalms, there is this commitment to righteousness and justice and to fairness for laborers and those sorts of things. This is not something we are making up because we want to be critical of one party or one or somehow call our own country into question as if we're being unpatriotic. This is really a deeply spiritual matter, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And look, since 1980, we've had a couple of Democratic presidents, right? And in spite of that, Democrat, Republican, or whatnot, there's only been one federal policy for the most vulnerable. All the other federal policies that have been passed have benefited the wealthiest people in this country.
Right.
That is a fact, and so it's a bipartisan attempt to make the wealthiest the wealthiest. You know?
Well, but it is also true that capitalism creates wealth in a way that no other system has ever accomplished, and that in that sense, Bill Gates will repeatedly say that we have virtually stamped out abject poverty worldwide in our generation, which is an extraordinary achievement. But it is not only capitalism that has done that. It is also humanitarianism. It is also the efforts of people of faith. So now I want to take you even more so into this role of religious communities, faith communities, because there are a lot of people who would say, this is taking care of the poor is really the work of the church. If we get tax deductions for contributions to our religious communities, churches, synagogues, mosques, religious nonprofits, they're the ones that should be doing this work, not the government. Because the government has a kind of coercive tax system that forces you to pay for something, but this is voluntary. And when it's voluntary, you have a tendency to be able, to motivate people in a way that you can't necessarily if it's just coming from the government. But the scale of this challenge is the thing that I think people do not realize fully. There's a role for the faith community, but there's a role for government too. Can you talk about how the faith community can become a kind of best practice modeling that then can be scaled on a larger basis?
Well, you have the kind of the social contract, which is the people of the country or the labor, business, and the government. And there's a balance in the social contract that where the government has responsibility to business and to people. Labor has a responsibility to business and government, and business has a responsibility to government and people. And when any of that gets out of whack, it doesn't work right.
Right.
I mean, and so we're talking about how to manage that social contract almost in a utilitarian sense, like for the greatest amount of good, for the greatest amount of people. So that's the first thing that comes to mind, George, about how to structure that. But the faith community as a model, I would say that every religion that I know of has deep moral convictions about how you care for the most vulnerable. You talked about the Hebrew Bible. The Jewish community has deep convictions, scriptural convictions about how to care for the orphan and the widow. Our own Christian tradition has the same. In Islam, one of the 5 pillars of Islam is almsgiving. They're Buddhists. Strict Buddhists don't eat meat because they don't want to harm another living being. So there is deep moral conviction and religious conviction around how we treat each other in this world, and it comes from the way we understand God. And so I do think there's something deeply important about being human and understanding your role and responsibility towards another human being, and on an individual basis, but also on a systemic basis. Right. You belong to a larger group, and you have responsibilities to that larger group, and that larger group has responsibilities to you. We play that out in religious communities every weekend for sure. And if we're really good, we play that out every day, right? And if you extend that to the larger community, that beyond the doors of your religious entity, then you really do care for everybody. And then you ask the question, what's best for all of us and for the world in which we live? That is not a bad way to begin a form of governing, rules of the community of how we interact with each other.
I think you mentioned the way churches, say, operate, religious communities as well. In all of our faith traditions, we try not to favor the rich over the poor. In fact, that's part of the argument that we have all the time organizationally. Is the chair of the finance committee the biggest giver? Are you just letting the deacon chair or the president of the congregation be, wealthy, and, are they dictating, or are we actually treating one another as equals, regardless of our economic status or our educational status, those sorts of things? This is something we strive in our religious communities to do. And then what's ironic to me is how often the minute we leave the doors of the faith buildings, we argue privileges, and we argue that we live in a Darwinian society, essentially, and that, it's winner take all, and that we have no responsibility to include our neighbor in the safety net or on ladders of opportunity. And we want to keep our taxes low so that we profit and somebody else doesn't get a handout. It's like we're bifurcated in our.
And part of that, George, comes to, like, Raj Chidi is an economist out of Stanford University. He did his education at Harvard. He's a smart guy, right? Raj came up with, he leveraged some big data going way back to kids growing up, and then followed them into adulthood, looking at their tax returns and things of that nature. And so it's this longitudinal study. And they basically, out of that, came up with like 5 indicators for poverty in America. And the number one indicator was segregation.
Wow.
Now, somebody in Dallas, Texas, or in Jackson, Mississippi, when we hear segregation, we automatically think of race.
Yes.
Well, that's not the kind of segregation Chidi's work talks about. It's economic segregation.
Wow.
The greatest segregation in this country is based on the fact that rich people live in rich neighborhoods, poor people live in poor neighborhoods, and middle class people live in middle class neighborhoods. Rich people never actually go into another neighborhood besides rich people's, right? The people who live in poor or middle class neighborhoods end up getting into those neighborhoods sometimes, but it's usually as laborers.
Yes.
And so the wealthiest people in this country are truly isolated from the majority of this country, and they do not know how bad it is in America. And the people who do are living towards the bottom. Yeah. And so that is a radical issue that we're facing in the United States. And as policy continues to create a country of haves and have-nots, the only thing right now that's separating the United States of America from a country that would be considered a third world country is infrastructure. The economics is already there. It's the infrastructure that's left, and it's crumbling. And when our infrastructure crumbles, and it's in the process of crumbling right now, there's no difference between the United States of America and a developing country in the world.
And when you talk infrastructure, you're not just talking about roads and railroads and things of that nature. You're talking about public schools. You're talking about health, access to health care. You're talking about all the kinds of things, access to healthy foods and things like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, access to food and healthy food is one of the biggest issues in rural space. I mean, a lot of our places live in food deserts where they have to go 10 to 15 miles to get a fresh leaf of anything. Right. In a city, I think it's 3 miles because of public transportation. But there's banking deserts where places don't have access to capital, and then the capital that they do have access to is payday lending and predatory lending, and so there's banking deserts. This is this is a real problem in the United States. And again, we don't see it because we are so segregated based on our neighborhoods and economics.
Well, I know you grew up in the Delta of Mississippi, and our church takes mission trips and has a relationship with the people there in Shaw, Mississippi, and in your home region there. And in the very few minutes we have left, Jason, can you give us some hope? You work for Together for Hope.
Yes.
So what are the signs of hope you see and the directions of hope that grow out of these kind of projects?
I'll say this. My grandmother was an illiterate sharecropper. Mm-hmm. And when she was 12, 13 years old, her dad said he would give her a quarter if she could pick 300 pounds of cotton in a day. That's about what a full grown man could pick, and it's a quarter of an acre of land. And she picked it. And he said, here's your quarter. Now that you know you can do it, go do it every day. And that's how she never went to school. She was born and raised in cotton fields. She died poor. As the hardest working woman I've ever met in my life. And that's, my whole family worked like that. And we were always poor, and we could never get ahead. And so the idea that you can work and make it, and that is a myth that really doesn't exist in this country like it once did. So I don't want to lead with like give us hope with that story, but I do want to say in that same vein, when I go across America in rural space, we focus on assets-based community development. We go into towns and say, what do you have? And it reorients the town, and they always leave going, we have more than we thought we did. Mm-hmm. And then we kind of say, all right, now you're the reframing ambassadors for your town. Whenever somebody talks bad about your town, say, hey, but we have X, Y, Z. Nice. And it is a powerful thing, because no matter how bad it is, or how economically poor, or how much of a poverty of hope, or a poverty of trust, or a poverty of love exists, as long as you have people, you have assets.
Wow.
People are the greatest assets of these small towns.
There we go.
And I think, as from a religious standpoint, it's because you have all these images of God walking around, caring for each other, loving each other in the midst of the pain and suffering. There is always hope. There's always assets if you have people.
Well, there couldn't be a better place to put a period on this conversation, and maybe even an exclamation point. Jason, you have really brought together the good and the God for this good God conversation. Thank you for the hope you've given us, for the good analysis, and for lots to chew on as we think about how we're part of the solution, not just part of the problem. Jason Coker, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, George.
Okay. Thank you for tuning in to Good God. We're grateful to provide this for you during this time of COVID-19 isolation. And we hope that it is a consolation to you during this time. There have to be lots of ways that we reach each other. And even though we can't be in a studio as we normally are producing these, we're finding the technology using Zoom and communicating it to you through this programming. We hope that you'll find it to be encouraging to you as we make our way through these difficult days.